Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today is a book club episode. We have Dr. Ayman Ibrahim back on our show, and he's going to be talking about his new book published by Baker Academic. It is a concise guide to the life of Muhammad. So we're going to be talking about Muhammad, obviously, and learning a little bit more about Islam and Muslims and their faith. And so we'll jump into this episode here in a moment. As a reminder, some show note reminders on your guys' end. If you're able to click the show notes and you see a link to Baker, you can find this book. You can also find other books Dr. Ibrahim did, like our last episode, which was a concise guide to the Quran, and you can also find some information on how to find the closest Reformed churches near you regarding the different denominations under the Reformed umbrella, PCA, URC, OPC, and among many others. So you just type in your zip code and the closest Reformed churches pop up near you. The most important thing you guys can do is worship in person as we are prescribed to do. So finding a local church is very important. You also find information on how to contact Peter and talk to him about his church in Santa Ana, California, Santa Ana Reformed. And then you can also find out a little bit more about what's called a bridge builder. We call that our financial supporters to our show. You can also find out how to contact and communicate with us, whether it's through Twitter, Instagram, or our email, which is guiltgracepod@gmail.com. So let's jump into the episode. I'll have Peter further introduce Dr. Ibrahim.
Yeah, so sorry for my slightly weird voice. I'm getting over, I don't know if it's like a head cold or just I was at elevation for a little bit. So my voice is coming back. It was a lot worse a few days ago, so it's coming back. But we're both excited to have Dr. Ayman Ibrahim, who's Bill and Connie Jenkins Professor of Islamic Studies and Director of the Center of Christian Understanding of Islam at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And he's written a bunch of works on Muslim engagement, about Islam, about the faith. We're very excited to have you on for the second time. As you had talked about when we first had you on, this book was coming out. So it's a pleasure to have you back on.
Thank you so much, Nick and Peter. It's wonderful to be with you, and I am really excited to spend this time with you about a book that I dearly love, and I hope everyone would get a chance to read and learn about Muhammad as the prophet of Islam as we connect with our Muslim neighbors around us.
Yeah, I agree. We were joking before the show. Dr. Ibrahim was trying to convince us it was a boring book, but it's actually it's a fascinating book. It's a lot of stuff that I know Nick and I did not know before. So to see some of these things, and we'll talk about some of these questions as we're in this show, but it really truly is a really interesting book. So I think those who are listening, you guys will both kind of enjoy the read, but also learn a lot from the book. And as Dr. Ibrahim says, kind of introduce yourself to kind of a world of literature, sources, primary sources, secondary sources, learn more about Muhammad. But so the first question that we got is, we didn't ask this the first time, but ask this now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then what brought you and your interest to Islam and Muhammad?
I was born and raised in Egypt, in the Middle East. Egypt is a Muslim majority country. By this, I mean we have the majority of the population claim to be following Islam. And still we have Christians, many of whom are nominal, are cultural, are traditional Christians, but we have also others who are committed believers in the gospel. So I was in Egypt all my life, and I worked as an engineer. I was surrounded by Muslims everywhere. And when I came to study theology in America, I was introduced to more and more literature on Islam, and I began examining Islamic texts. And the more I examined them and the more I interacted with Americans around me, the more I felt like, you know what? It's important for me to help my American friends understand Islam as a religion and Muslims as people following that religion. That's why I did my studies. I completed 2 PhDs in Islamic history and Muslim literature. And now I'm teaching at Southern Seminary. And I am hoping to be helpful to Christians around me to help them understand what actually is so important about Muhammad for Muslims. And that's why I wrote this book. And before that, I wrote about the Quran, the sacred Islamic text. And I love writing to help my Christian American friends around me. So yeah.
Yep, you helped at least 2 American Christian friends.
I think it's important for people to know that you are Christian, and you obviously living in Egypt most of your life, you know Islam because it's culturally the most prominent religion. But as a Christian, and obviously all 3 of us are Christian, most of our audience is Christians. Why even have this conversation? A lot of our obviously episodes are either just about Christian doctrine or even more specifically Reformed doctrine.
Yeah.
So why have a conversation as Christians? Why should we even talk about Muhammad and Islam? And why dedicate your research? I think you already kind of answered this question. Why dedicate your research as a Christian specifically to Islam studies?
Well, friends, it is a fact that 20% of the world population is now claiming to be Muslim. So if I am a Christian, if I am an ambassador of Christ, if I am someone who's really caring about proclaiming the good news, the hope, the gospel of hope, it is very important for me to be able to connect well with my Muslim neighbors. Muslim neighbors, you don't need to go now to fly to the Middle East to find Muslims. They are everywhere around you. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We are to be Christ's followers to all those around us. So if around me there are Muslims who claim to be devoted, to be following Islam, to be committed to the message of Muhammad, how would I connect with them without learning about what they believe?
Yeah.
That's where my book comes to answer important questions, to give information about the most important person for Muslims. And I answer these questions in a way that would help my Christian audience understand how to ask questions, how to connect with Muslims on a solid level of information, you know? So,
yeah, that's helpful background. I think it's a good jumping off point to the next question, kind of more substantively on the on the book. So your book has 2 parts, relatively equally weighted. So the first one's Muhammad's history, and then it moves to his message. So 2 parts of this question. First one is, how does the first part of your book kind of feed into the second part of your book, into the message? How does the history feed into the message? And then second is, how did you come to choose the topics, the questions that were in this book, as opposed to everything else that you could have asked about the Islamic faith or Muhammad in general?
Excellent question. How did I structure the book? Well, I know a lot about Muhammad from my studies, and I can. So I just sat down and thought about the most important things, but I just wanted to make it appealing. So basically, if you can make Muhammad's life summarized in 2 major sections, you will have to tell me about his history. What did he do? What did he how did he live? Where did he live? What is so significant about his life? That's the history part. But then you need to tell me about his message. What did he teach his followers? Why is it important that Muslims revere his sayings, for example? Oh my goodness. Yes. So basically, I needed to divide the book into two parts. One, tell me about his life and history, and the other about his teaching and message.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your second question is about what was it?
Yeah, the chapter title. So why choose the topics and the questions that you did?
So I had in mind several questions, and these questions came from my knowledge of Muhammad's life and teaching, but I wanted to be more appealing to my audience. So what did I do? I went to friends and I told them, if I'm going to write on Muhammad, what would you like to hear? What would you like me to answer? What are the puzzling questions in your opinion? So I got some questions from my friends, and then I wrote the book.
I love it.
You made your friends unknowingly do your research for you.
Exactly. I told them, what would you like to hear? Well, what did Muhammad say about Jesus? What did Muhammad? Of course, the easy questions came from my students. I tried to make the research questions coming from like my knowledge of the topic, like what is so significant about Muhammad's birth year? What is so significant about Muhammad's genealogy? These were not asked by my friends, so but I created them. So
yeah, that's helpful. So yeah, then something kind of I found most fascinating. So it's at Westminster, we focus a lot on text criticism. We focus a lot on like the textual history of the Bible. We read text critical scholars, people who do not like the Bible, who think that the Bible is made of all these different parts and try to criticize different parts. And you kind of bring the same perspective to the Quran, but also to Muhammad and his life. What I found striking was kind of how similar some of these questions were and how similar some of the responses were to both.
Yeah.
So can you describe, generally speaking, and you talk about this a lot, the kind of the critical view of Muhammad that you said it's really been rising as of late. This new kind of critical scholarship of Muhammad. That
absolutely.
I think for a Christian, like it's the same kind of questions we ask of the Bible that we now ask.
Yeah. Well, the fact is, Peter, is that before, like in the 19th century, there was a growing scholarship on Islam that was all done by Christian scholars, by even missionaries. So these Christian scholars and these missionaries began applying sort of what they did with the Bible on Islam's sacred texts. Now, missionaries were a bit onto the conservative side of things, but there were also some scholars who are coming to study the Bible from a critical perspective. And these scholars began applying the principles of higher criticism that they used with the Bible on the Quran. Now, in the last third of the 20th century, so we're talking about 1977, okay? There was a wonderful scholar of the Bible. He is a very liberal scholar, but he's very like scholarly. He's like very critical, and he applied the critical scholarship on the Bible that he used to do in the Bible on the Quran, and that created a huge momentum for what we call today the skeptical approach to Islam's text among scholars. And the person was John Wansbrough. Okay, so basically, you're very right. Some of the arguments that we read today about Islam and the Quran, about Muhammad's history, come from scholars who apply the higher criticism, the critical scholarship, they applied on the Bible, they applied on Islam's texts as well. So this is a very good observation. You're right. Yes.
Okay. And maybe to kind of getting into this stuff, and we'll go more into some of this with next question, but maybe to tee up some of the next questions with this is there's a lot of different texts on Muhammad. So it's not just the Quran, but there's writings that other people had. So how do kind of all these interact and give us either a fuller picture or potentially a contradictory picture of who Muhammad is?
Yeah. Well, I think we can say that if you want to know Muhammad's history, basically you will read the biography of Muhammad, Muhammad's sayings, and all these texts are really respected and revered by Muslims. They honor them. In chapter 2 in my book, I provide a list of these sources, and I provide also what is so unique about each of these sources. So what about the Quran? Many Muslims believe that the Quran is God's or Allah's speech, Allah's words. But many of us as Christians may tend to think that, okay, the Quran is Muhammad's teaching. Well, no, it is not. It is really not. For Muslims, it is more like it's Allah's word, okay? So in my book, I provide this list of books that Muslims rely on to understand their history, and they believe that this is a sacred history. The good parts about it, we need to imitate. So when they look at Muhammad's biography, they think, oh my goodness, he did that and he did that. So if I want to be the best person on the planet, I have to imitate him. That's what our Muslim friends think about and try to do. So basically, I'm providing the texts that Muslims use to understand their history and their teaching and their prophet's teaching. And this is what you can find in maybe in 2 chapters in my book, actually.
Yeah, and I got a couple questions, but I just kind of want to like start it off with some feedback or statements, or just kind of like throwing some stuff out there to see if I'm on the same page with you, because I think Peter also did. I read the entire book and I just recently finished it. So I think it's reflecting a lot of what the audience might be thinking or generally would think about Islam. I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out how later in history Islam actually started, and how much later Muhammad was born too. I think a lot of people think it was much earlier, and even and I know some Muslims believe that it's directly tied. Islam is directly tied to Ishmael, and that Muhammad is a direct descendant of Ishmael, even though there's centuries and centuries and centuries separating, because they see Islam as being there's a big part of Abraham being a father. Just as Judeo-Christians, we see Abraham as our father as well, but through Isaac, and they see it really through Ishmael. But there is also, as you know, there is inconsistencies and debates on really if Muhammad is really from Ishmael, and how can we really prove Islam is from Ishmael? And I think even like biblical, I know you didn't mention this in the book, but in our scripture in the Bible, Galatians 4, talking about the difference between, when Paul talks about the difference between Isaac and Ishmael. I don't know if you have any feedback on how this ties in. Let's go into that first.
I will summarize. Well, I will go very concisely on two points. Number one, we have a major problem when we deal with Islam, because all the texts that tell us of Islam's history are produced or were produced 2 centuries after the time of Muhammad. So this is huge. This is a huge problem because it's basically, we're not sure of anything we read about Islamic origins, Islamic early years. So indeed, I can read the story of Muhammad's life, but it's written by someone who lived 200 years after Muhammad, and we have no continued connection. We don't have, the transmission is probably not reliable at that time. So this is the bottom line. We have reasons to be skeptic with the story we currently possess about Muhammad and the early Islam. We have reasons for that. This is one thing. The other thing, there are major Muslim claims that are not supported except if you trust these sources. So these sources that are written centuries after Muhammad are telling me that Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael. Why they are saying this? Oh, wait a minute. Think about the context 2 centuries after Muhammad's time. Now Muslims are the rulers in the land, and they are interacting with Christians and Jews. And Christians are talking about Isaac, and Jews are talking about Isaac and Abraham. So Muslims are coming, hey, wait a minute. We have a part in this cake. We have something to do here. Mm-hmm. Why? Ishmael is the grandfather of Muhammad. So we are connected to Abraham because there is no other patriarch better than Abraham, okay? So Muslims came with this argument. However, if you dig deeper in the Muslim sources, you will find contradictions.
Yep.
Some of which will say, hey, Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael. Some, no, these are liars who say that. And that's what I answer in my book. I provide what Muslims claim, but at the same time, I bring from the Muslim sources some competing and contradicting reports about the same points.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And I mean, so Muhammad lived during the 7th century. And I think you were talking about the hadiths and the writings about Muhammad's life were like in the 9th century.
Right.
And also this goes to maybe a later conversation about how the Quran and Muhammad supposedly talk about Jesus Christ, which is obviously 7 to 9 centuries before even Islam even comes up. So there's a lot of huge question marks that you really bring out in this book that I think, like, my point of my question when I started talking was, I think on the front end, before someone reads this book, I think culturally and generally speaking, Christian and Muslim, we think this, those things that I kind of tied in, like Islam is perceived to be much older and much more ancient and tied maybe closer to the time of Christianity and Judaism, when it's in fact way later. And I think we think of the Quran, hadiths, and Muhammad all being way closer to time together as well, and you prove that's not the case as well. So I guess going into my first real question, so that kind of like tied it up. I just mentioned hadiths, and those are writings and works describing the life of Muhammad. And even though the Quran really doesn't mention Muhammad too many times, but there are many perspectives you take on the life of Muhammad and the hadiths. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. And the other writings. I will
tell you how to get it excellent.
and there's some other writings associated with him, because there's some that are talking about his military conquests and some that are other things that are specific about him. But what are these works? Can you dive in a little bit more about the hadiths and the works tied to
we have historical writings that tell us about Muhammad's history. So we have a collection that is called Maghazi, which means raids and expeditions. Muslims love to speak of Muhammad's expeditions, war, And there are collections of books that tell us about the history of Muhammad's wars or military activities. We have also a collection on Muhammad's biography by different people. Remember, all these books didn't exist by eyewitness. They came 2 centuries at least after the life of Muhammad. We have also the hadith. Hadith is the sayings of Muhammad. These are the traditions, hadith, we call it hadith. And these are so close to the hearts of many Muslims because it is very direct. It is like if the Quran is so general and you cannot really get a clear statement that is so precise in the Quran, it's sometimes vague. The hadith, Muhammad's saying, are so direct. This is what Muhammad said, and this is what you should do. So Muslims run to Muhammad's sayings to learn about life, and they want to apply it as it is. And then we have a collection, another collection on the wars after Muhammad's life, because the Muslim commanders led wars that we call conquest. We have another collection called histories. So all these are Muslim sources that we can examine to learn about the Muslim history. Now, you can use these books, which are mostly history, to learn about the teachings and the pattern of life of Muhammad. So when you read Muhammad's biography, you will find he dealt in this way with the Jews. He dealt in this way with Christians. He said that about Jesus and so forth. So when you read the historical accounts, you can still learn about the supposedly teaching of Muhammad. And I give some orientation on this aspect in my book. Yeah.
And the traditional and progressive Muslims might differ on how they view these hadiths and how they connect to the Quran.
Exactly. Yeah. And I write 2 chapters on this because it's very important to understand that Muslims are not the same. So for example, I can read today one of Muhammad's sayings, one of Muhammad's hadith. I would say the hadith goes like this: whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. That's the hadith. We're in trouble. If any Muslim changes his religion, then he must be killed, according to this statement attributed to Muhammad. So what would Muslims say? Well, if I am a conservative literalist, I will take this sentence and apply it by the letter. If I am progressive, living in America or living in the West, I would say, well, you know what, we're not sure Muhammad said that. One solution. 2, well, it is valid only in the 7th century. It is not valid now. Why? Well, we are living in a different era and we are operating in different contexts. So this is the struggle within Muslims today. Should I follow what Muhammad said, or should I contextualize it, or should I understand it as statements in history that have no bearing on today? And this is the big clash within the Muslim community around us between conservative and more traditionalists and liberal and progressive. And by the way, some progressives would say we are conservative too, but you know, it's all about the definition, you know.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And so in today's scholarship and society, how has Muhammad both been rightly and wrongly understood? I know that's a gigantic question, but
I wouldn't say rightly or wrongly, because it's all in the eyes of the beholder. Like right. it all comes down to what your perspective. But I would say that if we talk about, like, one of the chapters I write on the early non-Muslim or the early Christian, particularly early Christian views of Muhammad. So how did Christians in the first century of Islam view Muhammad? And I show different examples. Mostly, they viewed him as a trader or as a shepherd, or sometimes as a false prophet. Sometimes they made him as a charismatic preacher with some sort of a message. They were trying to figure out Muhammad, okay? And then it developed throughout time. But for the most part, if you look at the first three centuries of Christian-Muslim interaction, the views of Muhammad were negative. It wasn't, they were not really in any way positive. Like no Christian scholar I know of in the early period of Islam viewed Muhammad as a true prophet, you know? So anyway, we can delve deeper here, but it's found in the book and you will find many examples. I hope they are helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me add a question to that. And this one's not on the ones that I originally asked, but it's cropping up now. And I think, and you allude to it in the book throughout a couple of chapters, but in general, how was Muhammad viewed, not just by Christians, but by his contemporaries in his time versus how was he viewed?
Well, that's a great question. So your question is, how did Muslims during the time of Muhammad view him?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know, like scientifically and from a critical point of view, I have no idea. Because basically we don't have eyewitness, okay? However, I can tell you what Muslims 2 centuries after Muhammad wrote about him. They wrote glowing things. Anything good is Muhammad. Anything great is Muhammad. Great in terms of their context, their time, okay? So for example, they wrote about him in his dealings with his wives. They wrote about him as a warrior. Oh my goodness. Would you today talk about Muhammad as a warlord? It's going to be kind of controversial. Why? Because we are in a different time. But for early Muslims, it was huge that Muhammad was a commander in battles, succeeding to win over his enemies, succeeding and overcoming the Jews and even Christians and all this. So that was the way that early Muslims described Muhammad, okay? Now, if you look at what later Muslims describe Muhammad, you will find it in the same direction. But always remember this. The conversations Muslims advance about Muhammad are always related to their context. So, for example, early Muslims didn't care much about was Islam spread by the sword. They didn't care. It's like, what? Muhammad won battles and that proved that Allah was supporting him. Well, later on in our era, no, you will find many Muslims who would argue the opposite. No, Islam didn't spread by the sword. There was no violence and so forth. Why they are saying that? Because today we get the question about the violence in early Islam and the violence in the life of Muhammad. So Muslims are responding to this kind of questioning, you know? So I hope that helps.
Yeah, and then one more before I think Nick was going to add something too. So one little thing too was, and you talk about this towards the end of the book. Was Muhammad more of a religious figure, or was he potentially more of a political or military figure? And so, can you maybe like tease out that difference?
Yeah, great. Well, when you think about Muhammad, you will find that you can talk about different Muhammads with an S. So basically we have, and that question actually is related to, did Muhammad really exist?
Yeah.
When people ask me, did Muhammad exist? Was he a historical figure? It's like the question about, was Jesus a historical figure? Okay, you know. Mm-hmm. So when people ask me, did Muhammad exist? I have to ask, which Muhammad are you talking about? So you will find one Muhammad is the Muhammad that is in the mind of Muslims around me, nominal Muslims who know nothing but think that Muhammad is the best of humankind. So he loved pets and he was kind to everyone around him. He smiled to everyone. Where did you get this information? Well, I don't know, but that's the Muhammad in my mind. Okay, so I call this the legend Muhammad. Now, the second Muhammad is the Muhammad of the tradition of the hadith, Muhammad sayings, and the biography of Muhammad and the history of Islam. This kind of Muhammad is not so much well known among the masses of Muslims around us. They have the legend more in their mind. And actually, the traditional Muhammad that comes from the tradition is an invented Muhammad, because basically everything we know about him comes from 2 centuries at least after his death. So it's very skeptical. I'm very skeptical about that one. Now, what about the last Muhammad that I mentioned in my book? It's the historical Muhammad. Mm-hmm. Well, there is probably someone called named Muhammad, who lived in the 7th century Arabia. And we know very little about him from eyewitnesses. All are Christians, or majority are Christians around Arabia. So someone during Muhammad, like 2 years after Muhammad's supposed death, wrote about him, oh, there was a false prophet who appeared among the Arabs. Well, we don't know a lot about that false prophet, and probably he's Muhammad, but it wasn't, maybe. And then we find that, oh, this Muhammad was the leader of the Arabs in this war against the Palestinians. Oh, so he's now mentioned by name, and so forth. So we're talking about different Muhammads. And I hope that my audience would understand that we need to be careful as we distinguish between the three and even more. But these are the basics, you know.
That's really helpful, I think, for our audience, where I think, at least today, my impression, this could be wrong, is like you think of only one Muhammad, only one story, only one kind of person. You don't think that there really is like kind of a broad range of views of who he is. Yeah, because there's really nothing to tell us exactly who he is.
And basically, Peter, let me help you. If you talk with a nominal Muslim, cultural Muslim, you are probably talking about a legend, the Muhammad of the legend. Someone who's out there doing everything good. You know what? I'm not religious. I don't care about details. So if you're talking with a religious Muslim, someone who's committed to Islam and Islamic texts, you're probably talking about the traditional Muhammad, the Muhammad that comes from the tradition. If you're talking with a scholar who is very skeptical about the texts and all this, you're probably talking about the historical Muhammad, and you will probably reach the point where we don't know a lot about him.
Yeah. And I would hate for this conversation to run out of time, because I think there's some good stuff to still cover. So I think what would be a good idea is I want to ask a few questions, and be as concise as you want, because I think they're really good to just cover. They're both in your book, and I think they just stuck out as, like, I think things people would find really they're curious about. So I think we kind of skipped, not that we intentionally did it, in a good way. This conversation is very organic, but I want to take a step back and go back to the basics of introducing Muhammad. I think we need to know, based on writings of him, who, like, the significance of the year that he was born, and why did he think allegedly he was a prophet?
Good question. I think we can say that the story that Muslims wrote about Muhammad portray him as, in many aspects, as the Messiah, the savior of the Arabs. So he came in the hardest times of the Arabs because all of them were pagan worshippers. So this man came and was born in a particular time, and he brought a message of monotheism. So the story of Muhammad's life is a response to a lot of stories around the same time of writing. So they wanted to make Muhammad appear as someone who came to save the Arabs from paganism, someone who came to make sure that the worship of idols is obsolete, is done. They wanted also to portray, and all this I say they wanted to portray him because basically we don't really have trust in these, in the how reliable these sources are. So for example, in one of the stories about his birth date, you find Muslims saying that 1,000 miles far from his home where he was born, the enemies of the Arabs, the Persians, saw miracles, and the palace of the Persian leader shook, like was shaking, because Muhammad was born 1,000 miles. What do we read here? We read similar stories that we find in the biblical narratives, for example. So Muslims want to portray Muhammad's birth in the same way as you find in the biblical narrative. So you find Moses is protected from the death of many babies around him. Oh, you find Muhammad as someone, when he came through his mother never felt a pain. She saw a light. So Muslims formed the story of Muhammad's birth and life and genealogy in a way to connect with their Jews and Christians around them. I hope that helps.
No, that was fantastic. And so Muhammad, it's something really important to Islam is that Allah is one God, and obviously with the Trinity we believe that, but Islam has misunderstanding of what us Christians talk about with our triune God.
Yeah,
that's very important to know. And when you're talking to a Muslim, to defining terms and trying to explain the Trinity, but something even in the Quran is very important to them is that Allah is one God. And so was Muhammad always a monotheist, meaning that
good.
He always a monotheist?
So let me first answer, yes. In Islam, the deity is absolute one. The deity does not have plurality in his unity. Okay, so that's in Islam. Okay, I say why this is problematic, because there are various reasons. The strict monotheism doesn't answer important questions. Just to think of the attributes of the deity. If he's loving whom, and being loved by whom, and so forth. So this is an important point that I cover in the book. Now, the Muslim tradition insists that Muhammad was a monotheist all his life. Why is that? Because it is important for Muslims to portray Muhammad as inerrant, as infallible. So that's an important, if Muhammad was at some point believing in idols or pagans, then he commit a sin. And in Islam, prophets are protected from sin, from committing sins. So What Muslims did in their traditions, they wrote stories about Muhammad as a unique man who was born believing in one God. But then some accounts don't make sense, because we are told, for example, that during Muhammad's life, he at some point told his followers, how about you go seek intercession from 3 idols? Man, this means that at some point, at least according to the Muslim sources, Muhammad was not a monotheist. He sought the intercession of pagan goddesses like idols. So all this is to say that many times, on the one hand, you will find Muslims insisting on a particular aspect about Muhammad. When you begin reading their sources, their books, you will find that the two don't match. You will find that you have accounts that prove the opposite of what Muslims claim. And there are many aspects in my book that show this kind of contradiction, you know.
So, and we know Muslims believe Muhammad is the final greatest prophet, and I would love it if you can explain Muhammad's dream story where he's on a winged creature, because I think that helps explain a few different questions of because it explains the relation that Muslims have to biblical figures, where how they think of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. And how, I mean, obviously it's totally different than what we are claim biblically true.
Sure.
So, but that, I think that dream story, whether it's true or not, we can decide, but
sure.
We don't think obviously it's true, but I think the relation with those what Muslims call the earlier prophets helps explain the idea of who Muhammad is compared to the other prophets.
Well, you are talking about what Muslims call the night journey of Muhammad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you read the Quran insists that Muhammad did not perform miracles.
Right.
Okay? But then we're talking about 2 centuries after Muhammad. And the Muslims are surrounded by Jews and Christians. Jews have Moses who performed miracles, and Christians know Jesus fed the multitude, Jesus calmed the sea, and all this, okay? And then they come to Muslims. What did Muhammad do? He brought the Quran. Go. We don't want to hear that. Mm-hmm. It's not a miracle. Mm-hmm. So Muslims tried to create stories of Muhammad's miracles to correspond with their audience, Christians and Jews. And one of the stories was this tradition of Muhammad riding a horse like a horse with a wing, flying from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem up in the 7th heaven. So you read the story and it says that, okay, Muhammad performed miracles. Forget about how the Quran insists that Muhammad didn't perform miracles. But for Muslims who lived centuries after Muhammad, this was appealing. We want to present Muhammad with a miracle. Now, we wanted also to present Muhammad as the best prophet. So in that story, he meets with earlier prophets and leads them in prayer. Wow. See how these features are compelling? And then we hear him going all the way up to meet with Allah. Wow. And Allah tells him about how many times you should pray, you and all Muslims. So you hear all this story. And then, wait a minute, there are gaps in the story. Not only that the Quran insists that Muhammad didn't perform miracles, we read in other stories in the Muslim history that Muhammad learned the prayer much earlier, years before that. So how would you reconcile these two traditions? Contradictory. And then you read in the Muslim sources themselves that even Muhammad's wife told other Muslims around her that this was a dream. It wasn't a physical miracle. Well, how would we reconcile these traditions? All this is to say that, yes, indeed, there was a story of a miracle, but even Muslim sources contradict it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's because it's interesting as I'm listening to your answers as we kind of move towards the end of this, that in maybe to juxtapose, to kind of compare the Christian Bible, so all 66 books of the Bible, and then what we call the apocryphal, so those that are outside, or the pseudepigraphical, all these things are outside. We don't see the same authority in either of these texts. It seems a little bit different like as a Muslim looks at the Quran, they look at the Hadith, they look at all these other things,
right,
as relatively kind of on the same grounding, where like you can kind of get different sources to see.
Well, there is nothing like the Quran, Peter. Nothing for Muslims is like the Quran. It's number one.
Mm-hmm.
This is followed by Muhammad's sayings.
Okay.
We call the Hadith. Okay. And these are equal to some extent with Muhammad's biography, because we Muslims want to imitate Muhammad. So where do you learn about Muhammad's life?
Yeah.
Go to his sayings and his biography, and so forth. But I would say that the Quran is number one, followed by Muhammad's sayings or Muhammad's tradition and Muhammad's biography.
Yeah.
Which contradict each other quite a bit too.
Which is interesting how they don't agree on a lot of these things.
The problem now, which I conclude the book with, is that many Muslims now in the information age are realizing, there are lots and lots of contradictory material here and things that don't make sense. Like in the last 2 chapters of my book on Muhammad, I provide illogical sayings of Muhammad, illogical sayings about Allah. You cannot say this about the deity. So many Muslims today are saying, you know what? Forget about the Muhammad sayings, forget about all the tradition. I'm sticking to the Quran and the Quran alone. Why are they saying that? Because the Quran is, for the most part, general, and in some instances, it's vague. So you can take it anywhere to fit your context. So that's a good thing for Muslims, okay? So they are trying to distance themselves from all traditions and stick to the Quran and the Quran alone.
I think this conversation will be helpful for not even like misconceptions for those who don't know the Islamic faith, who just don't even know the Islamic faith, and maybe even like think they know something about the Islamic faith, when in all reality we don't. In much of these respects, so it's helpful having this as a guide.
I really hope that our audience would get a chance to read this book and to find they will find a lot of important questions, a lot of critical key questions that they can use in their conversations with Muslims around them. And I hope that our audience find helpful tools here. Like I provide a lot of lists of websites to help you access important material about Islam. So anyway, I hope everyone enjoys this book, you know?
And I think too, it's your kind of directive on the front end in your introduction, talking about primary sources versus secondary sources, where you talked about the information age. We're finally in this age where we can access these resources, these primary sources, and versus kind of getting a secondhand account for what somebody thought it said. We could actually read the stuff for ourselves.
Absolutely.
So that's I'll save one of my questions for a future episode that we will very likely have. We'll tease that one out a little bit, but so we appreciate your work, appreciate your book, appreciate your research on some of this stuff. Oh, Nick has something to add.
So it's just a quick comment too. I think that first section in your book, the Muhammad's history, it's incredibly helpful laying the groundwork of not just Muhammad, but Islam. So you can come into this book knowing nothing, and you're going to come away learning things
Which
like
was me. I knew nothing.
And it's that's okay. I think it's helpful for us to come in, open mind, read this, and we're going to learn, how many wives Muhammad had, how he died, being by poisoned. What's the difference between
Or supposedly
Sunnis
by
and
poison.
yeah, and what's the difference between Sunnis and Shiites? What's the Kaaba? What's a caliph? What's the jihad? What's the difference between the Quran and the Hadiths? So I before Peter
And
cuts
one
me
day
off.
Nick will say Hadith right.
It's okay. You know what I mean. And
Good job. No problem.
before Peter cuts me off, I think these are two really good maybe ending point questions, unless Peter has something else. Is what do you think is important for Christians to know about Muhammad and Islam, and what do you think is important for Muslims to know about Jesus and Christianity?
Man, this is a huge question, but I think it's important that we know that Muslims are not all the same, and we deal with different Muslims all the time. Some of them are nominal, cultural, some are religious, devoted, some are very progressive, and some are radical. You hear about this too. It's important to tell our audience that Muhammad is a very important person in Islam, and actually, if Islam has two major foundations, it's the Quran and Muhammad. So if these two foundations by any means are shaking, are not trusted, Islam will collapse. And I know many Muslims around me who have begun to question one of these two pillars, if I may call them. And it's a journey that they call, you know what, I'm not sure I am following this anymore. So as for Muslims to learn about Christianity, Christianity is not about a book. Christianity is about the person of Christ. And I don't think of Christianity as a religion, because religion, by definition, is you're doing something to reach the deity. I think Christianity is a life in which God took the initiative to reach you. That's, and of course we can talk more, but I think that's.
We will be talking a little bit more about this stuff. So we're inviting Dr. Ibrahim on again for a future season. We will not announce yet until it's a little bit closer. So you guys can be looking forward to that. But even before we recorded, you talked to us about some of the works that you have coming up, even after this stuff. So if you want to kind of plug what you have coming up and what you're working on, that our listeners could be looking forward to.
I have a book coming out in August that I am collecting many Christian thinkers who wrote in the medieval era interacting with Islam. And what did they say about Islam, the Quran, and Muhammad? It's going to be a fascinating book that would help the classroom.
You have a chapter on that in this whole book too, so it's kind of sounds like it's expanded.
Yeah, and then I have a book on how to connect with your Muslim neighbor with the gospel, coming out in October, God willing. And I am beginning another book with a major publisher on Muhammad's wars. What do we know about Muhammad's wars? And finally, I am also writing a book that would help non-Muslims understand Islamic terms. What is Allahu Akbar? What is jihad? What is, and all this. So I compiled many terms and trying to give some explanation to each term to help non-Muslims around me. So
I love it.
Lots of work. Yeah.
No, that's good. Maybe a little bit of a plug to for those seminarians who are working hard on Hebrew, which is, so I'm about to graduate in 3 days. So
Wow.
taking Hebrew at Westminster, Arabic comes a little bit faster because a lot of the
Okay.
words are very similar. And
Yes,
so when you talk
exactly.
about some of these things, like, oh, I know where that is from Hebrew. So it's,
Yeah, I published the textbook on Arabic. So if you
Yeah.
know that. So.
Okay.
yep. Yeah. So if you, it's a plug if you're like, why should I do Hebrew? It's like, at least part of it, you can understand some Arabic terms.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And
Thank you both.
yeah, we will have you on again soon.
Thank you, and may the Lord bless you. And it was a joy to connect with you both, Nick and
Yeah.
Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.